the blue planet?
The Earth is made of a lot of different things. There's iron, some nickel, and there's all sorts of other elements.
Spectacular canyons and volcanoes.
A really dynamic place that was very different in the past and will be very different in the future.
The expansive Earth, explosive volcanoes, extraordinary weather, majestic mountains, rushing rivers, and many, many different landscapes we call home. To better understand our planet, we look to geology.
Geology is the study of the Earth, of everything that's underneath us, the rocks and the rivers and the dirt and soil and volcanoes and all of the processes that make the Earth what it is.
To think of the Earth in a simplistic way as being the third planet from the Sun out of 9 or perhaps 10 planets. We live on it, and life is perhaps the most important thing on it, but we have a tendency to study, as geologists, the physical structure of the Earth and its ancient history.
Everything you look at tells an amazing and fantastic story about the Earth, and there's so many different stories that the Earth reveals.
Our Earth has a very long and very dynamic history, starting with the bang and the formation of the Earth and our solar system.
We think that very early in the history of our solar system, there was a large circulating mass of gases and dusts, and that the dust particles started to collide and coalesce with one another, and that our early planet formed in response to collisions of all of those dust particles held together by a gravitational attraction.
This hypothesis of how the Earth formed is called the solar nebular hypothesis. A nebula is a cloud of interstellar gas, and the theory is the basic idea that the Sun and the planets formed in the same nebular material.
If the nebular material is dense enough, if there's enough dust and gas, it'll begin to kind of collapse in on itself and begin to swirl about. As it collapses, it generates an enormous amount of heat, eventually causing nuclear fusion, which will produce something called an embryonic sun in the middle. Once you form that sun, I'd say about 99% or so of all the mass in that nebular cloud is contained in the sun. What little itsy-bitsy particles were swimming around out there that were left over after the sun was made, glommed on together to form the planets.
And then, you know, of course, there are all these other planetary masses floating around, things coming in to hit the Earth, bouncing off to form the moon, bouncing off to form these other little bits of asteroids and comets and things like that.
The Earth and the solar system are composed of many chemical elements. Some are very heavy or dense, like iron and nickel, and others are light, like hydrogen and helium.
We do see the same chemical elements distributed throughout our solar system, but they're distributed in somewhat different ways, so that the planets that, as you get further and further out in the solar system, you see a greater abundance of the very light gaseous elements. And that as you get closer to the sun, there are more of the heavy elements that fell in through gravitational attraction towards the center of our solar system.
Our Earth is largely composed of iron, oxygen, silicon, magnesium, nickel, and sulfur.
There's an idea, a theory, a hypothesis that early in Earth's formation that it was a homogeneous ball. Basically, all the material that makes up the Earth was evenly distributed throughout that ball. At some point, the Earth was heated, and we think that through the process of meteoric impact, radioactive decay, and what's called gravitational compression, the Earth heated sufficiently to allow all this material to separate out and differentiate by density, meaning that the heavy stuff sunk to the middle and the light stuff floated out to the surface.
Fundamentally, it's a very simple concept that the denser rocks, the rocks with a higher percentage of iron and nickel and other related elements, move to the deep parts of the Earth, and the lighter rocks with quartz and feldspar move to the upper parts of the Earth. And the result is a rather simple, elegant, three-layered Earth.
Our planet is made up of three main layers: the crust, the mantle, and the core.
This ball that we call the Earth, you could often think of it as being like a more spherical hard-boiled egg. where it has a yolk in the interior that is what we call the core. And that core is actually made up of two different parts. Part of it is solid and part of it is liquid.
And the core of the Earth is almost exclusively composed of iron. The outer core of the Earth is liquid, and the inner core of the Earth is basically like a large iron sphere or ball kind of floating in this liquid outer core.
The mantle can be compared to the white part of the hard-boiled egg. It contains 67% of the overall mass of the Earth.
And there's the mantle, which is sort of like pliable, movable rock, and then there's the crust, which is the lightest stuff that stays on the edge of the Earth, kind of like the shell on an egg.
The crust of the Earth really is just like the eggshell getting broken up, but able to then slide around on that hard-boiled white of an egg.
The crust is broken up into moving tectonic plates. These plates recycle the crust from materials deep inside the Earth. And as they move about the surface, they are responsible for not only the beautiful mountains, but the deadly earthquakes and violent eruptions.
Have we, taken a fancy futuristic drill ship down into the guts of the Earth to see where these layers are and what's down there? No, we've actually never seen, or even sampled for that matter, the deep interior of the Earth. So the question is, how do we know that the Earth is layered? Earthquakes are handy in that they produce shock waves that penetrate through the entire Earth. And those shock waves can be used like an X-ray in an X-ray machine to image the various layers that we see within the Earth. Seismic stations that are basically spread over the globe receive these earthquake waves.
When an earthquake happens, seismic waves propagate in all these different directions, and they propagate through the Earth as well. And they bounce off different layers, the hard layers, the soft layers in the Earth, and we can tell based on those arrival times, their speeds, what they went through, basically.
If the Earth was a homogeneous ball made out of the same stuff, those waves wouldn't change or bend or do anything funny as they pass through the Earth. But what we find is that those earthquake waves behave in a variety of different ways.
As we look at our Earth from space, we see more than the rocks and the land. We see the blue water and clouds. And as we get closer, we see plants and even animals. So, our planet is more than the rocks and minerals that make up the Earth. Modern Earth science looks at the Earth as an entire system, a group of interactive parts that form the complex whole. This system includes the solid Earth, as well as the hydrosphere, that is all the water, the biosphere, which is all of the life, and the atmosphere, the protective gaseous outer layer. Our Earth has changed and continues to change, and Earth scientists are searching for clues to unravel the complex events that have occurred over the vast history of our planet.
But an Earth scientist is trying to understand, why did the dinosaurs become extinct? Well, that happened 65 million years ago, and no human beings were around then to look at what the Earth's surface looked like at that time, to look at the atmosphere, to look at the Earth's vegetation, to try to look at what was going on then, to gain a sense or to appreciate why, entire, major groups of organisms at that time living would have gone extinct. So our challenge is to develop ways or techniques, some of which are very clever, to try to tease that story out of the record that's left. And that's the challenge of being an earth scientist. It's almost like it's almost like being a detective, at the scene of a crime.
Throughout time, geologists have used observations to interpret the Earth's history. In the 1600s and 1700s, people thought the age of the Earth was relatively young.
Back then, the theory that was accepted for the formation of the Earth, for the formation of layers of rock, for fossils, was this theory called catastrophism. Basically, that things happened very quickly all at once. The Great Flood, for instance, that's talked about in the Bible, that was thought of a way that could have transferred all this material that happened very quickly, and fossils were deposited, and that's kind of how that formed. So the age of the Earth was thought to be very young, thousands of years.
One of the very early milestones in the study of geology came about in the late 1700s through a Scottish geologist named James Hutton, who developed a theory or proposed a theory called uniformitarianism, which basically states that the present is the key to the past.
The theory of uniformitarianism states the physical, chemical, and biological laws that operate today have also operated in the geological past.
And this was a completely revolutionary idea that is still very, very powerful today, that we can go out to a river like the Rio Grande and we can see that river carrying sand and silt and clay particles downstream, and when the water is flowing quickly, it's carrying more material. When it slows down, it drops that sediment out, and we can see how the sediment accumulates over time, and it makes it much easier to go back in time and to look, for example, at an ancient sandstone and say, I know how this formed, I know how long it would have taken that sediment to accumulate because I can make direct observations today on similar processes.
Completely changed the way we thought about how old the Earth was, how rocks formed, and it made people think on a different time scale, basically. And you know, geology is all about time scale. So things don't happen in thousands of years. You know, we're thinking about millions of years, billions of years. So, you know, that's the time frame we're looking at, and we're looking at processes that happen very slowly. You know, plate movements that happen a centimeter a year, deposition of sediments that happen millimeters per year. So that's an entirely different way of looking than you know, way back when people were considering how the Earth formed.
This discovery led geologists to try and learn more about the age of the Earth, as well as its history by dating rocks.
There are two ways we can date rocks. One is relative dating and one is absolute dating. And relative dating is we don't have the exact age of the rock, but we can make observations of some rocks and see that, you know, the layers on the bottom are going to be older than the layers on the top. We can look at the sequence of events that have occurred and work out which one's oldest and which one's youngest.
Relative age dating means that by looking at these layers of rocks, known as strata, we can determine if something is younger than or older than something else. Relative age dating is based on a few basic principles. One of the most fundamental is the law of superposition, which states that in beds of sedimentary rock, each bed is older than the one above it. Another basic principle is the principle of original horizontality, which states that layers of rocks are generally deposited in a horizontal position. But sometimes, geologic processes can interrupt these horizontal layers. Layers can be bent and twisted, or even turned upside down. And sometimes, cracks or faults in an existing rock are filled with magma that cools and results in an igneous rock. This is known as the principle of cross-cutting relationships, which states that the igneous intrusion is always younger than the rock it cuts across. These, as well as other principles, help geologists discover relative time relationships and create a logical order of events on Earth.
Another way to tell the time relationship in an outcrop or in a group of rocks is to look at the fossils that have been deposited in them. We have a good idea of when a certain species existed or during what time period. And by correlating that to the rock sediments and what's around it, below it, beside it, you can get a good sense of, you know, what happened when it was deposited, when did this intrusion come in, when did this lava flow happen, based on the other rocks around it.
By looking at things like the way that roads cut through the rock, you're actually looking at part of the story of time. You're looking at individual pages of what processes were going on, because each of those layers is telling you a different story. It tells you whether you had a stream that had moved through here, and then later that stream was buried by, you know, a swamp when water level had come up, and then maybe later another stream cut through it. And just by looking at the types of rocks and the types of fossils in the rocks tells you that individual story.
While rocks and fossils help tell the Earth's history, geologists have found other ways to get information.
We can look in ice cores. These are up in the glacial regions, in the polar regions. Ice cores that can be miles thick. And there's banding that exists in these ice cores, the summer-winter bands, where we can actually count backwards and determine that this is the year 1352, And in that year, because in the ice record we see an ash layer, there was a large volcano that took place at that time. So we can make relative comparisons of ages that way.
In addition to establishing relative ages, we now have a way to give reliable numerical dates to the Earth's events and materials through absolute age dating. Absolute age dating is based on the natural radioactive decay of certain elements, which occurs at a constant rate throughout time.
So by measuring how much we have today and how much of the decay product is there today, we can very accurately determine the age at which a mineral or a rock fragment or a pottery shard or an old tree that's buried in a sediment, what the age of that material is. So it's been very beneficial for unraveling the time scale of Earth history.
In 1980, father and son scientist Walter and Louis Alvarez found strong evidence that a giant asteroid hit the Earth around 65 million years ago, drastically changing the environment and possibly killing off the dinosaurs.
Up until that point, that was always one of the big mysteries, is how did the dinosaurs actually go extinct? And so this recognition that catastrophism actually does occur. First, it was everything was catastrophic, Noah's flood. Then it became uniformitarianism, where everything was the same through history. And now we've recognized that it's more complicated. It's neither one nor the other. We have periods where things don't change, and then perhaps rare but really catastrophic events that have occurred in the past.
And so it's like reading a history book, but each page is a very long period of time. And we use the fossils and the different rock types and so on to try and reconstruct events going back to the early history of our planet.
The thing that really separates geology from all other science is the fact that geology deals with vast sums of time, time that most humans cannot even begin to relate to.
Geological time is often referred to as deep time. It's very difficult to conceive of. We talk about such incredibly long expanses of time. We think our planet was formed about 4.6 billion years ago.
But what does that number really mean? How vast is 4.6 billion years? It's mind-boggling.
It is almost impossible for us to comprehend this geologic deep time. But by condensing 4.6 billion years into a one-year calendar, we can begin to appreciate the vast history of the Earth. In this one-year comparison, each second will equal about 146 years, and each day 12.6 million years. And we begin when the Earth formed out of a nebula on January 1st. The oldest found rocks date back 3.8 billion years, March 4th on our calendar. The first bacteria appeared 3.25 billion years ago. But more than 1 billion years passed before the first cells with a nucleus appear on July 17th. It is not until September 30th that the first multi-celled organisms, such as seaweed and algae, appeared, 1.5 billion years ago. On November 21st, only 500 million years ago, the first fish appeared, and later, on November 24th, there was fossil evidence that the first land plants appeared. On December 1st, the first insects arrived, followed by sharks on December 2nd, 370 million years ago. December 12th begins the age of the reptiles, including the dinosaurs, who first appeared 228 million years ago and reigned the Earth for nearly 2 weeks until the 26th of December, when a giant meteor slammed into the Earth, causing mass extinction. On December 28th, 2 days later, the first monkeys appeared. And on New Year's Eve, December 31st at 11:48 p.m., Homo sapiens arrived. And over the next 12 minutes, all of human history would unfold, including the rise and falls of empires, and man's landing on the moon, which would take place a quarter of a second before the stroke of midnight. Geology is a relatively new science. We are just scratching the surface of what we can know about the history of this awesome planet.
Most people think of geology as simply the study of rocks. But for me, geology is much, much more than just looking at rocks. It's about all of the different earth processes that shape the surface of the earth where we live, that control things like volcanism and earthquakes and where all of our natural resources come from.
One of the things I really like about geology, you get a chance to sort of really find out about the physical earth you live on, which you never really think about from day to day. We know a lot about the cars we drive, about the houses we have, about the computers we own, but we don't know about the very thing that we're walking on every day.
Geology is a fascinating and extremely exciting science because you're looking at so many different aspects of the Earth. And it ties in biology and astronomy and physics and atmospheric science and oceanography and so many things that there's no singular aspect of geology. And almost everything you look at tells an amazing and fantastic story about the Earth.
Geologists have been able to unravel many of the mysteries of the Earth's history, but we still have a long way to go in understanding our planet's diverse terrain and the processes that shape our dynamic world.